There is a sentence circulating right now among Korean educators that very few people expected to read in a serious newspaper column, and it has nothing to do with test scores, university admissions, or classroom discipline. It says, in essence, that a 20-something pop star performing under stadium lights halfway across the world has become something closer to a living textbook for character education. The columnist who wrote it is not a fan account, not an entertainment blogger, and not someone chasing clicks. He is a retired middle school principal, a career educator who spent decades inside the Korean public school system before turning to writing, and on July 10, 2026, his column ran in the Central Education newspaper under a title that translates roughly to the functional relationship between stage artists and school character education. The subject of that column was Jimin of BTS, and by the time you finish hearing what is actually in it, you will understand exactly why a lifelong educator felt the need to put this in writing. Before we get into the specifics, it helps to understand just how unusual this kind of column actually is within Korean education media. Education columns in Korea tend to circle a fairly predictable set of topics: university entrance exam reform, teacher burnout, classroom discipline policy, the growing role of AI in education, the widening gap between public and private education. A column that spends its entire length focused on the conduct of an active pop idol is, structurally speaking, an outlier. Editors at education publications do not typically greenlight pieces built around entertainers unless the argument being made has real substance behind it, because the audience reading these outlets is professional, skeptical, and largely uninterested in celebrity gossip. That context alone should tell you something about how seriously this particular argument was taken before it ever reached print. The columnist's name is John J. Hack, known in his writing circles by the pen name Ingek, and he is not a casual observer of Korean education policy. He served as the principal of Sangaknam Middle School in Incheon, and since stepping away from that role, he has become one of the more prolific and widely republished education columnists in Korea, with his essays regularly appearing across multiple education-focused outlets. His columns tend to cover exactly the kind of subjects you would expect from someone who spent a career shaping school policy: character education frameworks, the gap between what textbooks teach and what students actually absorb, the role of teachers in a rapidly changing digital classroom, the tension between academic pressure and emotional development in Korean youth. This is a person whose professional life has been built around asking one core question again and again: how do we actually raise young people with good character, not just good grades? So when someone with that background chooses to write an entire column centered on a K-pop idol, it is worth pausing to ask what could possibly justify that choice. The argument at the heart of the column is fairly direct once you strip away the academic language. John argues that character education in Korean schools has become, in his words, something closer to fossilized morality sitting quietly inside a textbook. Students read about honesty, kindness, and civic responsibility as abstract concepts, memorize them for an exam, and move on without ever internalizing them as lived behavior. What he proposes instead is that character education needs living examples, real people whose public actions demonstrate these values in ways students can actually observe, discuss, and be moved by. And then he makes a central claim that Jimin, of all the public figures currently visible to Korean and global youth, has positioned himself as one of the clearest examples of this kind of embodied character education. Not through any deliberate campaign to be seen as a role model, but simply through a pattern of consistent, quiet, repeated action over the better part of a decade. The first piece of evidence the column lays out involves Jimin's giving history connected to education itself, which is what makes the argument land so precisely. According to the reporting referenced in the column, Jimin began making substantial donations to the Busan Metropolitan Office of Education, channeling support toward underprivileged and at-risk youth in his hometown. This was not framed as a one-time publicity gesture. The column describes it as an ongoing commitment that started years earlier and has continued steadily since, structured specifically to help students in Busan who face economic hardship get access to the same educational opportunities as their peers. What makes this detail resonate with an education columnist in particular is the target of the giving. This was not a general charitable donation routed through a foundation with his name attached to a plaque. It was money directed specifically at keeping vulnerable kids inside the education system, which is about as close as a celebrity can get to putting resources directly into the exact institution the columnist has spent his life defending. The column then notes something that elevates this from a simple hometown pride story into something more deliberate. Jimin's education-related giving did not stay confined to Busan. He extended similar support to the Jeollanam-do Office of Education, a region he has no personal or biographical connection to whatsoever. He was not born there, he has no reported family ties there, and there was no obvious public relations angle that would make that specific choice make sense from a marketing perspective. The columnist reads this as significant precisely because it removes the easiest cynical explanation. If the giving had stayed limited to his own hometown, you could reasonably describe it as an extension of local pride or personal sentiment. Extending it to an unconnected province suggests something closer to an actual value system at work, a belief that educational opportunity matters as a principle rather than as a hometown favor. It is also worth pointing out how this pattern of giving fits into a broader tradition that Korean fans sometimes call the culture of the anonymous idol donor, where artists quietly fund scholarships, medical costs, or disaster relief without ever issuing a press release about it, letting the recipient organizations confirm the details only when journalists or foundations independently report on them later. Jimin has been associated with this kind of giving for years, often surfacing only when a school district, a foundation, or a local education office publicly thanks a donor and reporters trace the contribution back to him. That pattern of letting the institution speak, rather than promoting it himself, is part of what gives the column's argument its weight. Because character education, by definition, is supposed to be about internal motivation rather than external reward. A donation made purely for publicity teaches very little about character. A donation made and then left unannounced for years, only surfacing because someone else chose to disclose it, is a far closer match to the kind of values a columnist like John is trying to encourage in students. Layered on top of that is the detail about Jimin's contribution toward the National Museum of Korea, again structured to benefit students and young people accessing cultural and historical education. Put together, what the column is assembling is a pattern rather than a single headline. It is not one grand gesture engineered for a press cycle. It is donation after donation, region after region, institution after institution, each one quietly aimed at the same target, giving young people, many of whom will never meet him and many of whom may not even be BTS fans, better access to education and cultural literacy. For a columnist whose entire professional identity is built around asking how you actually instill values in young people rather than just teaching them values on paper, this repeated pattern of unpublicized structural giving is far more persuasive than a single viral act of charity ever could be. From there, the column widens its lens to the international stage, because Jimin's connection to youth development did not begin or end with financial donations inside Korea. It references the UNICEF Love Myself campaign, the multi-year partnership BTS built with UNICEF specifically targeting violence against children and adolescents around the world, which grew into a global conversation about self-worth and mental health among young people well beyond the K-pop fandom itself. It also references the moment in September 2018 when BTS stood together at the United Nations General Assembly for the Speak Yourself address, a speech built around exactly the message the campaign had been pushing for years, urging young people everywhere to find and use their own voice rather than being defined by outside expectations. The column frames this not as a marketing campaign attached to an album cycle, but as an early demonstration that these artists were willing to put their platform toward youth welfare on a genuinely global scale, years before the character education column itself was ever written. In other words, the column is arguing that this most recent recognition did not appear out of nowhere. It is the natural continuation of a pattern that has been visible and documented for the better part of a decade. It is worth lingering for a moment on just how significant the Speak Yourself address actually was within the history of youth advocacy, because it is easy to let a phrase like "spoke at the United Nations" pass by without registering the weight of it. This was not a ceremonial photo opportunity. It was a deliberate, sustained partnership that began years earlier with the Love Myself campaign, structured around real fundraising and real programming aimed at ending violence against children and young people in schools, homes, and online spaces around the world. By the time BTS stood in front of the General Assembly, they were not simply celebrities lending their fame to a cause for an afternoon. They were representing a multi-year initiative with measurable outcomes, and the speech itself became one of the most widely referenced moments in the group's entire career, specifically because of how directly it spoke to teenagers navigating self-doubt, external pressure, and the difficulty of forming an identity in a world that constantly tells young people who they should be instead of who they are. For a character education columnist writing in 2026, that speech is not a nostalgic throwback. It is foundational evidence that this pattern of youth-centered advocacy did not begin recently or opportunistically. It has been consistent for the better part of a decade. And then the column arrives at the moment that likely pushed John to sit down and actually write this piece in the first place, rather than simply filing Jimin away as a generally admirable public figure. During the European leg of the ongoing Arirang World Tour, at the Brussels stop held at King Baudouin Stadium at the start of July 2026, Jimin was performing in front of tens of thousands of fans when he noticed a fan in the crowd who appeared to be in genuine distress. Rather than continuing the show and trusting security to handle it from a distance, or simply pausing for a few seconds before moving on, Jimin stopped the performance entirely. In front of an enormous stadium audience, with cameras rolling and the entire show effectively on hold, he made sure that fan received help before he was willing to continue. This is the kind of moment that, on the surface, looks like it belongs at an entertainment headline, the sort of clip that circulates for a day or two as a heartwarming viral video and then fades. But for an education columnist, this single unscripted decision, made under enormous pressure and in front of an audience of that size, is worth more analytically than almost any prepared statement or planned charitable campaign could ever be. Prepared generosity can be curated. A split-second decision made live in front of tens of thousands of people with no time to consult a publicist cannot be staged in the same way. It reveals something closer to instinct than image management, and instinct is exactly what character education is trying to build in young people in the first place. Consider the actual mechanics of what was happening in that stadium during that pause. A concert of that scale involves an enormous amount of coordination, a production team, a lighting crew, a live broadcast feed in some cases, a set list built around specific timing, and tens of thousands of fans who have often traveled long distances and spent significant money for that exact experience. Stopping a show mid-performance is not a small decision. It disrupts the production, it creates uncertainty for everyone involved, and it carries real financial and logistical consequences. And yet, in that moment, none of that outweighed the priority of making sure one individual fan was safe and cared for. That hierarchy of values, placing a single person's well-being above the smooth continuation of an enormous, expensive, meticulously planned production, is exactly the kind of concrete, observable behavior that a character education curriculum could actually build a lesson plan around. It is not abstract. It is not hypothetical. It happened in front of a stadium full of witnesses and was captured on video from multiple angles, which means students can watch it directly rather than simply being told about it secondhand. This is really the crux of what makes John's argument land the way it does, and it is worth sitting with for a moment because it reframes the entire conversation about what a role model even is. Traditional character education, the kind found in Korean textbooks and moral education curricula, tends to rely on distant historical figures, war heroes, independence fighters, ancient sages whose stories are true but whose lives feel abstract and unreachable to a 15-year-old scrolling through a phone between classes. John's argument is that this distance is precisely the weakness. Students can recite the definition of compassion for an exam without feeling any real emotional pull toward practicing it, because the examples they are given feel like museum pieces rather than living proof that these values still function in the real world. What Jimin offers, in the columnist's framing, is proximity. He is not a distant historical abstraction. He is someone teenagers are already watching, already listening to, already emotionally invested in, which means that when he demonstrates compassion, when he demonstrates consistency, when he demonstrates that using influence to quietly support education systems matters more than using it to build a personal brand, the lesson actually has a chance of sticking. The column essentially argues that this is what modern character education should look like, not replacing the old models entirely, but recognizing that young people learn values most effectively from people they already feel connected to, and building curriculum and classroom discussion around examples that are alive, current, and observable in real time. It is worth being honest about why this particular argument carries extra weight coming from someone in John's position rather than from a fan writing on social media. A former school principal has spent an entire career being skeptical of celebrity culture as a substitute for genuine education. Teachers and administrators are trained, almost by professional instinct, to be wary of anything that looks like idol worship distracting students from academics. For someone from that world to write a column arguing the opposite, that a specific idol's actions actually reinforce rather than undermine the values schools are trying to teach, is not a small thing. It suggests that the pattern of behavior being pointed to is substantial enough to override that natural skepticism. This is not a puff piece written to chase engagement. It reads like the conclusion of someone who watched the evidence accumulate over several years, the donations, the UN appearance, the UNICEF partnership, and now the Brussels moment, and eventually decided that ignoring the pattern would be a disservice to his own professional argument about what character education actually requires. For everyone who has followed Jimin and BTS for any length of time, none of this individual piece of evidence is new information. The Busan donations have been quietly known within the fandom for years. The UNICEF partnership and the Speak Yourself speech are core parts of BTS history that ARMY has celebrated since 2018. The Brussels moment has already been widely discussed and admired across fan spaces since it happened. What is new, and what makes this worth talking about, is seeing an outside authority, someone with zero incentive to flatter a fandom and every professional incentive to be skeptical of celebrity influence, assemble these same pieces of evidence into a formal argument about educational value. It is one thing for fans to say Jimin is a good person. It is an entirely different kind of validation when a career educator writes it into a published column intended for teachers, parents, and school administrators, arguing that this specific artist's conduct deserves to be studied and discussed in the context of how young people develop character. It is also worth thinking about what this means for the students who will eventually encounter Jimin's story inside an actual classroom discussion, if John's argument gains any traction among his fellow educators. Character education lesson plans in Korea have historically leaned on figures who feel emotionally distant to teenagers, admirals, independence activists, philosophers whose worldview was shaped by circumstances no modern 15-year-old could realistically imagine living through. None of that makes those figures less worthy of study, but it does create a gap between the lesson and the student's own life. A framework built around someone like Jimin closes that gap almost entirely. Students do not need a history teacher to explain who he is or why his choices matter in context. Many of them already follow his every move, already understand the pressure of performing in front of huge audiences, already have opinions about how public figures should behave under scrutiny. That familiarity is not a distraction from learning, in John's framing. It is the exact condition that makes the lesson land. There is also something worth noting about the timing and the broader moment this column exists within. It arrives in the middle of the Arirang World Tour's European run, a period where BTS and its individual members have been almost constantly visible across news cycles, from fashion appearances to viral concert moments to milestone announcements. In the middle of all of that noise, most of it focused on spectacle, outfits, ticket sales, and trending topics, this column stands out precisely because it is not trying to be viral at all. It was written for an education trade publication, read primarily by teachers and school administrators, not by K-pop fans scrolling social media. The fact that it eventually surfaced and spread within fan communities is almost incidental to its original purpose. It was not written to be shared. It was written because a professional educator genuinely believed the argument needed to be made, which arguably makes it more credible, not less. So what do you actually do with a piece of information like this? If you are already familiar with Jimin's history, this column functions as external confirmation of something you already sensed, that the consistency behind his public actions over the years amounts to more than good publicity, that it reflects something closer to genuine character. If you are less familiar with him, or you are the kind of person who tends to be skeptical of celebrity culture in general, this is precisely the kind of evidence worth taking seriously, because it did not come from inside the fandom. It came from someone whose entire career was built on being critical of exactly the kind of shallow celebrity influence this column argues Jimin does not represent. Before you go, think about what actually stood out to you most in everything you just heard. Was it the years of quiet donations to education offices in regions he has no personal connection to? Was it the 2018 UN speech that still holds up as one of the more meaningful moments in K-pop history? Or was it the Brussels moment, the unscripted decision made in front of tens of thousands of people to stop everything and make sure one fan was okay? Drop your answer in the comments, because that conversation is exactly the kind of discussion John J. Hack was hoping to spark when he sat down to write this column in the first place. If this video gave you a new way to think about what it actually means to influence young people for the better, hit like so more people see the story. And subscribe if you want to keep following the Arirang World Tour and everything happening around BTS as it continues to unfold across Europe and beyond. There is a lot more coming from this tour, and a lot more worth talking about. See you in the next video.